Catherine, do you think we can start? Okay. Welcome everybody to the second webinar of the Speak Up South Africa competition. As you know, this is a partnership project between the School of Journalism and Media Studies and the Campaign for Freedom of Expression. I'm going to hand over straight away to Catherine White, who heads the communication head at the Campaign for Freedom of Expression. She is, as you will have known from last time, an award-winning multimedia journalist and also an alumni of the school. So I'm very happy to have her with us here again. So over to you, Catherine.
Thank you, Prof. Yes, you might remember me from last time, and I'm here to represent the Campaign for Free Expression in hosting the seminar. This is the second part of a 5-part series that we're doing as the Speak Up Essay Initiative. As you mentioned, Prof, in collaboration with the School of Journalism and Media Studies. And our topic today, the ethical challenges in media and storytelling. So as journalists, we have a code of ethics, but quite often, you know, what looks good on paper might not actually be what the reality is and what journalists are dealing with on a day-to-day basis. And of course, we have challenges that we are exposed to. So I think it's fantastic that we can come together and talk to journalists with loads of experience who are willing to share some of their stories. And, there are loads of questions to ask, and these aren't always easy to answer. So that's why we're here, to explore the gray areas and to learn from the people in the field. And we have a wonderful panel of esteemed names in the South African journalism space, as well as a journalist who is all the way up in East Africa. And just before I introduce the panel, I really hope that this session inspires you. I hope it challenges you. It's going to be quite an informal session, similar to the way that we approached things last time. You're welcome to ask your questions, pop them in the chat, raise your hand as we go along. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce to you Mia Malan, the founder and editor-in-chief of Bhekisisa Center for Health Journalism, which is a leading South African outlet reporting on health and social justice. She's an award-winning journalist with over 2 decades of experience. She's worked across Africa and in the United States. She's a former Knight International Journalism Fellow, and Mia's reporting, especially during the COVID-19 pandemic, has earned her international recognition and numerous awards. So she is a respected voice on health matters, media ethics, and particularly journalism in the Global South. So Mia, I'd like to open to you for your opening remarks on some of these challenges that we might face as journalists and as media practitioners regarding the ethics. Are you still with us, Mia?
I'm back.
Great. There we go. Over to you. We'd love to hear your thoughts on the topic.
Sure. So I thought I'm a health journalist, so I thought I would address 2 things. The one is consent, of when is it really ethical to accept that someone has given consent. So I learned a very big lesson in the year that I started Bhekisisa in 2013. I was working at the Malan Guardian, and the editor at the time was Angela Quintal, who is really very ethical. And I thought, I've always been ethical. There's not going to be problems with me. And then I did a story. I traveled to the rural Eastern Cape, to a village called Hubeni. It's close to Elliotdale. And I visited a project that a center that had mentally disabled and also mentally ill people. But the ones who were mentally disabled, there was something special about them. They were mostly women, and all of them had been raped. And they were, of course, easy targets in the village, in the community to be raped because, you know, they were less alert often. They were just easier to target. And the headline of the story was, you can Google it, it's still on our website, was called "If They Are Raped, So What?" And that was a sort of a reflection of that the community didn't value them, and it wasn't an Eastern Cape rural village thing. That's how communities react towards people that they value less. And the central character in my story was a woman in her 20s, and she had a child who was 5 or 6, and the child was the result of a rape. And a caretaker, many of the people, specifically this woman, her family had no contact with her. So her legal guardian almost was the caretaker, the person who headed up the organization. And she told me it was fine to show pictures of the woman, not her child, but you know, it's okay to identify the woman. She signed a consent form, and the only requirement was it must be a humane story. And I had written my story. It went through the whole editorial process. The news editor had signed off on it. The head sub had signed off on it. Everyone who had to sign off had signed off. And Angela stormed to my desk and she said, "I'm not publishing this story. Not under my watch will we identify a mentally disabled person." And the picture wasn't a full face picture of her. It was really just a picture of her around the fire with a child. You couldn't see the child's face. And Angela taught me a very, very important lesson that evening. And it was a Wednesday evening when the deadline of the Malan Guardian for the print edition was normally to sign off on pages. And that was that no one can really give you consent to show the picture of a mentally disabled person because no one lives their lives and you can't decide for them. And I had to replace 3 pictures that evening. I luckily did have some where faces weren't showed, or I had to use completely different pictures, you know, that didn't involve the woman in some cases. But that incident, I've remembered for the past 12 years because it taught me the lesson, what is consent? And even if someone themselves sign a form for consent, it doesn't always mean consent. That there could be really, really bad implications for people. So it's about who can give consent for themselves. And sometimes people sign a form. They don't need to be meant, any person who signs a form. And they don't realize the implications of speaking to you with their name, for instance. So I've learned that if there is danger that I can see, but the person I speak to, the interviewee, can't see, or if there's potential discrimination, I don't identify them. And it brings you to the next point. Is a story really less powerful if you use a pseudonym, if you don't use someone's actual name? And I have learned it's not less powerful. The credibility or the power of the story lies in how you tell it, not on whether you used a real name. And it lies in who else you quote. You know, if the other people that you can identify, say experts around the issue, are credible. And one example is, I think it was also in 2013 or 2014. There were lots of problems with traditional circumcisions in Pondoland. And I did a story about men who doctors call amputees. And that is a medical term for someone who was circumcised. They didn't die, they survived, but they lost their penis. And the story was about they fled from village to village because as soon as they get into a relationship with women and they now get to the stage where they want to have sex, then of course they need to move on. And I interviewed 5 amputees. Their doctor put me in touch with them. And I didn't identify, obviously, a single one of them. But the doctor was very credible because he was clearly worked at, I think it was Mount Frere Hospital, if I remember correctly. And he worked there. So he gave, it was clear from the comments that that doctor gave that I couldn't possibly have made up the stories of the men, because that's of course what people wonder about. If you use pseudonyms, is it true? But you can tell the story in a very true way, a truthful way, without names often. And that story resulted in an entire policy change around circumcision in the Eastern Cape, and specifically for that village. Doctors were allowed to help in a way that was culturally acceptable. And in the end, the Wits University and the National Schools of the Arts, they wrote a play based on this story without names that they performed around the country. So it taught me, respecting people and the way in which you approach a story, that ethics weigh heavier, and that credibility of a story rarely relies on whether you named someone. The other issue that I thought I would talk about is, what do you do during health crises like a pandemic, HIV or COVID? What is ethical and what are the implications of being unethical during times like that? Now, during times like that, information can literally save people or kill people. It's not just confusing people. You can really, with your reporting, lead people to decisions that can end their lives. So if you look at something like COVID, for instance, vaccines, in the case of ARVs, we had a period of HIV denialism in the late 90s and 20s. I was a very young reporter then. And during that time, it was so important to give the right information about ARVs, even if the president gave the wrong information, because it meant life or death. And during COVID with vaccines, it was the same thing. But it is also really important that if you want to report accurately during a time like that you don't oversell solutions. So in the case of vaccines, for instance, we learned very quickly that the vaccines were fantastic with saving lives. So if you were vaccinated, you didn't fall as ill as you would have fallen if you were unvaccinated. But we learned very quickly that it didn't stop infections. You didn't not get infected if you were vaccinated. You were just protected in how badly the illness would affect you. And I think then it becomes very important to understand the science correctly and to give people the right information. What can something do for you and what can it not do for you? It is not ethical during a time like that to give equal weight to opinions. So if there's a non-evidence opinion, which is clearly not based on evidence, for instance, say during COVID, opinion that ivermectin can, save you or cure you from COVID. It is very unethical during a time like that to then have a story, is it or isn't it? And you give like people who believe ivermectin can cure you an equal voice to those who use evidence and say it really can't. It's a drug for parasitic diseases. It doesn't help for viruses. So I think it's very important to not amplify, because if you give them equal weight, then you amplify the misinformation. And a good way to get around that is something that you may have heard of, a sandwich message, a sandwich method, where you start a story with a correct fact and then the wrong thing that someone said is buried in the middle and you go to a correct fact again. So you would, for instance, say if we look at something like the recent comments of the health secretary in the US, RFK, who said diphtheria vaccines that an international organization helps African countries to buy. He said it kills more people than saves more people. So you would start off with a study that found so many lives have been saved, and then you say, yet RFK says it's killed more people, and then you go to a correct fact and say, this diphtheria vaccine, has been proved safe and effective in whichever year and was introduced in, say, the year. And then you go on to the story. The other thing that I think is really important during times of crisis, where people need science to understand things, is I think, easy language is almost more important than just trying to be accurate. And I think it's unethical for reporters to use industry language and jargon that people don't understand and that they obviously don't understand themselves, because the less you understand about an issue, the more fancy the words are that you use, because you start copying and pasting it from press releases or from studies. So I think part of ethics during a time like that is that you spend enough time to make sure you understand the things that you report on well enough, not to confuse people, but more importantly, to allow people to access the information in an easy to understand way. And the last thing is, today we really can't argue as journalists. If you're a print journalist, you cannot possibly think that you've done your job once you've published the story on a website. You have to acknowledge that we live in a world where things like Instagram Reels and TikTok Reels are part of news. And I think it's unethical not to skill yourself with those things, that you have to be able to translate that print story into a more accessible form for a social media audience. Because if you don't, then you don't fight misinformation, because those are the channels which people use for misinformation. And you don't reach all the audiences that you possibly can, because we know people find different parts of the population find the information on different channels. It's no longer 10 or 20 years ago where everyone goes to the same place. That's my last thing. I think otherwise you haven't done your job if you don't skill yourself in all the possible ways of storytelling.
Yeah, well, thank you for that contribution, Mia. Absolutely. I don't know if unethical is the word, but certainly unwise to not be skilled in these fields. And what you mentioned about consent, sometimes one might be given consent, but that does not necessarily mean that, we should then make the decision, even though I do have consent, what would the impact be of showing this person's face, as you've mentioned. So consent, very important there as well. Joining us as well, we have Khadija Patel, another experienced media leader. So she pushes words on street corners. She's a director at the International Fund for Public Interest Media. She led the Mail and Guardian as editor-in-chief, co-founder of the award-winning Daily Vox, and also served as chairperson of the Vienna-based International Press Institute. Khadija, thank you for joining us and availing this time. We know you're busy, and I'd like to hand over to you for your opening remarks.
Thanks so much, Catherine. And it was fascinating listening to Mia, because it reminded me as well of my own experience and how, the challenges of actually informed consent, and the pressure to get the story, and to get the story that that stings the best, and balancing that up is not always easy, and it's not always clear, even for years. So I wasn't going to tell the story, but I'll tell the story. Several years ago, while I was still working for the Daily Maverick, Farrell Haffajee, who was then at the City Press, commissioned me to write a feature about the neighborhood in Johannesburg where I'm from, which is called Mayfair. And she basically, she has heritage here as well, and she's intrigued by how vibrant the community is and how much it's changed, but also how much it is the center of so much of wrongdoing. And so she asked me to write the story reflecting on this. And so I thought I wrote a really good piece. It was, of course, we needed pictures of people. We had great pictures of the place, but we needed people. And walked around Mayfair for a full day with the city press photographer, trying to get people to agree to pictures. So Mayfair is a hub for immigration in Johannesburg. So lots of different communities. There's a large Malawian diaspora, Ugandan, Somali, Ethiopian. And so we're walking down the street known to be a hub for Somali immigrants in the area. And there's this fantastic picture of a row of women who are sitting beside each other on the roadside selling coffee. And fantastic picture because they're all like very vibrantly dressed. You have the juxtaposition of the street, fantastic picture. They all agree to have their picture taken, no problem. That becomes the big picture in the city press that weekend. I carry on with my life, and I have no idea that that I had done anything terrible. And about a year later, I'm back in the community because I'm now writing a book about Mayfair and trying to find the same people I had spoken to for that story. And I was met with a very angry mob of people, which I couldn't understand, who all said that I had written some very bad things about the Somali women. And I take my phone, I pull up the story, and that's not true. Here's the story. Like, I didn't write anything. And and even though we had this confrontation, it's really like surrounded by like about 50 people shouting at me, I still didn't understand because no one also could properly explain, except they told me that I basically said that the Somali women are prostitutes. And obviously I would not depict something that is not true. So I was very, very confused. And so again, I just put this down to, cultural difficulties. And it took me, I think, another year where I picked up that City Press article again, and I looked at the caption because I had never actually looked closely at the caption of that story. And beneath the picture of the women was the caption, "In Mayfair, you can get whatever you want," right? And so, yeah, it's a terrible caption. It's a terrible, terrible caption. Somehow, for 2 years, I never even read it. I never even saw it. But obviously, this is what stuck out for the people who are depicted in the story, right? It didn't matter what else I had written there. What had stuck out is that I had somehow implied that Somali women in Mayfair are easy to get. And this had had profound implications, I now understand, for the reputation of those women who we had photographed. So there are moments like that that will characterize your career, right? There are quick moments that are not always, you don't always have an Angela Quintal who can make you understand why you cannot do that, right? And somehow you have to piece it together in your head after years. But I also wanted to talk briefly about, I think that increasingly we need to think about the ethics of media management and the ethics of hiring people at a time of particular insecurity within the sector. What does it mean to uphold the rights of journalists as workers, the rights of journalists as journalists, to uphold their right to safety, for example? These are questions, of course, that I grappled with profoundly when I was at the Mail and Guardian at a time of increasing financial precarity. And juxtaposed to this is organizations, large organizations that may become more cavalier in some of their decision making when it comes to business management. And what does that do for the reputation then of the journalist, the individual reputation of the journalist, but also the collective reputation of the journalism being produced? And we're seeing this being replicated around the world now. The death of journalism doesn't come with a sudden off switch, but rather, you see a gradual contraction of things like, like safety, things like just whether people are paid on time. These are all safety issues. These are all ethical considerations. When we think about ethics, we often think about, some of the things that Mia spoke about, but I think that increasingly also we have to think about the practice of journalism and the execution of journalism as work and its ethical implications for human beings. Of course, there's a lot of buzz around this, around AI, and people want to think about what does AI mean for this. But I think that we also have to reflect quite deeply about how a very rapidly changing sector has ethical implications for the nature of work for journalists.
Thank you very much, Khadija. Beautifully put. And touching on the media management side of things, I think that's a perfect segue into introducing the other panelist. We have Gloria Irankunda. Gloria, you have to tell me if I've pronounced it correctly this time. She's a young features reporter at Daily Monitor newspaper. Which is part of the NMG Media Group. She's based in Kampala, Uganda, joining us all the way from there. And she's been in the newsroom for 2.5 years, amplifying human interest narratives through her storytelling. And she's an alumni of the Media Challenge Fellowship and Leadership Advanced Program. So I'd like to hand over to you, Gloria. We've had some interesting discussions prior to this meeting about things like being paid for stories. Please give us an idea. You're in East Africa. You're reporting for one of the biggest East African outlets, and you've really got a sense of what's happening around you. Can you share some of that with us? What are your thoughts on this topic and how it relates to where you are right now in Kampala?
Thank you so much, Catherine, and the previous speakers. I'm really glad to hear from other journalists how they're making it out there, how they are trying to put together stories which have impact on communities and societies and individuals. And for me, I would want to point to the aspect of journalists keeping their reputation as one of the code of ethics that we are given as journalists. We are always told to keep reputation, to protect our reputation, because we are told that we have to give the information to the public and not sell it to them, because the public has the right to information. But I think in the past few years, I think things have changed. When we reached in the newsroom, I've been there for 2.5 years. The senior journalists told us how they were passionate about the work they were doing. They were so excited to see their bylines in the newspapers. They were so excited to hear their voices on TVs. But right now, a journalist may not be happy if they hear their voice on TV or see their byline in the newspaper when their pockets are empty. So that shows you how things are changing, and the media houses are struggling. So that means that if journalists are not really paid well, they will end up compromising with the way they saw stories. They will pitch story ideas, not because they've thought about pitching these story ideas, but because someone has reached out to them and maybe they want to give some handouts, they want to give some money. So the journalists will look for a way to put together a story And I think that is not the way we should do it, because I feel like we should report about stories that are relatable to the public, because someone goes to read a story because they relate to it. And so that is one of the factors that I feel like is compromising with journalists around here where I live in Uganda. I don't know about other countries, but that's something that we are struggling with. Recently, someone reached out to me and they wanted me to profile them, and they had really done some good work. I had been following them up, but I didn't have time to go to them. But really, they had a newsworthy story to report about. So I told my colleague about it, and she said that that's some good money that you're going to get. So I said, what do you mean? She said, yeah, they should pay you for that story, but look, these stories are paid in the newsroom. Each story is paid, but now journalists go ahead to ask for money from the sources, because sometimes that's the only way they can survive. They are living in the city, they have bills to pay, so that's something hard. And these people are willing to pay because someone is really proud to see their photos, their name in the newspaper. They feel like they are going to reach a bigger audience if maybe a national newspaper publishes them. So they will fight for space, they'll fight to be in the newspaper, they will offer any amount of money that you ask. But I feel like if you have a mindset of doing the right thing, still you go ahead and do the right thing, because if you're given money to do a story, trust me, you will, even when you want to tell the truth, you will feel like, I've been given money, maybe I shouldn't include this, I should remove this paragraph. So finances are a big issue. The second thing I would like to talk about is about people in authority or the government, or the conditions that we report in and where we are. We report in an environment whereby even I think the president or the ministers read the newspaper. So sometimes if you've heard about how the feedback maybe came in, maybe a government official calls you. I had an instance where a colleague called a minister for a comment in her story, and the minister said that your media house has twist stories. They report negative stories. So I'm not going to give you this comment because I don't think you're going to put it the right way. So, and this is a news story, you have to have it in maybe at a certain time. We work for a daily paper, and the paper should be out every day. And this is a minister who would authenticate your story. So once you leave them out, you know, the other side, they are pushing you, you won't get, you should report the right thing in the newsroom, but then the minister wants you to put something that favors them. So your truth is compromised. You end up maybe sidelining with the sources. And I feel like that's not the right thing to do. It's hard. Journalists are really suffering to get information. And these are the things that we face every day, year by year. And so I'm grateful for such spaces that bring us together to interact about this and talk about the issues we face. And probably we can get some solutions on how others are doing it out there. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for your contribution. So just to mention again, you're welcome to put your questions in the chat, raise your hand. We're so happy that you're part of this discussion if you are on this meeting with us. And we will also make this meeting available on YouTube. So you can have a look there. The previous seminar was there as well. But this really is a space to engage, and we'd love to hear your thoughts, especially from coming from the students. I've got loads of questions on my end. So panelists, please feel free to jump in at any point, something you might find interesting. I'm interested in what you're saying, Gloria, about the state of freedom of expression in particular in Uganda right now, looking at how, well, not just Uganda, but how certain political parties can influence the press, can influence individuals. And then it's a question of whether that's the journalist's responsibility, or sorry, whether that falls on the journalist or whether that falls on the editorial team to kind of navigate what story, like where is the power when we talk about representation. So I'd like to open up. There are many questions from my end, but please do raise your hand if you'd like to make a contribution. Panelists, do you have any kind of response to what's been said?
You know, Khadija made me think about when she spoke about management, you know, and the ethics of that. There's also a component to that about we have cash-strapped media organizations and what kind of sponsored posts do they accept. And as a health journalist, I am aware of, you know, things in the health world when that happens. So one of the tactics that the tobacco industry use is they pay for scientists to do science, and then you come up with results that's in favor of the tobacco industry. And at the moment, the most common thing is that they sell vaping or e-cigarettes as a safe alternative to smoking. And there really isn't enough evidence for that. And there is a lot of evidence that shows that vapes actually get teenagers hooked on nicotine much easier, or much easier than cigarettes, or at a younger age. And then later on, they move on to tobacco and they start smoking. And I have seen in our media industry, from News 24 to Times Live to everyone, I think I haven't seen it in the Daily Maverick, but like the sponsored posts of tobacco industry that would be a very well-written story about science that's simply not, you know, true. And it says, and it wouldn't say that the study was sponsored by the tobacco industry. And in the same edition, you would have an actual real story that says exactly the opposite. And what are the ethics about what kind of money do you accept to survive? Is it ethical to publish something like that that is simply not true, but also you have cash-strapped media organizations where an editor probably wouldn't know whether it's true to start off with. They wouldn't know what they're publishing. And who do you accept money from? I work for a donor-funded organization, so we survive from philanthropic organizations. And increasingly, pharmaceutical companies have corporate social investment arms. So do you take money from them or not? For me, the clear rule up until recently has been, of course not, because, you know, as a health media organization, I don't want to be associated with a pharmaceutical company that sometimes outprices drugs or refuse to let go of patents. And I then was a co-trainer in a workshop a few months ago that was run by a very credible, large media group, an international media group. And when I joined that day, that's when I learned, oh my goodness, Roche, which is a large pharmaceutical company, is sponsoring this training and actually is choosing the speakers. Now, Roche is very well known for outpricing a breast cancer drug that can really save people, and they refuse to let go of the patent. And I was wondering when I was there, like, how is a training like this credible, where they choose speakers, and of course it's about cancer, the training, and yet the organization is not a, you know, organization that I don't respect. And I wonder about the ethics. I would love to hear what Khadija thinks about that. You know, money is very scarce. Is it okay to do that?
Yeah, I mean, Mia, you know, when you talk about the tobacco industry, I was actually thinking about a situation we faced together at the MNG when we were together, when you actually had written a piece, or your team had written a piece about a campaign that the tobacco industry in South Africa had undertaken, then a public campaign against the illicit tobacco industry. And we had no idea in the newsroom, of course, that our commercial team had actually sold space for that same campaign to be, to have, I think they had a full page on that day. Meanwhile, on almost the page opposite, we have Mia's team, or I'm not sure if it was you yourself who'd written it, Mia, I don't recall, basically taking down some of the phony facts that were being used in this campaign, but also the extent to which a lot of the media partnerships, I think they were very early implementer, the tobacco industry at that time, of using influencers to spread a message, and not influencers to sell something, but rather influencers to influence public opinion, and as individual content creators. And so it was I can't recall how we found out that. I think it was only when we actually had the pages all together, because when we're putting the paper together, we just know that there's the space for an ad, and it will basically have like initials, like ad 10/7 F&B, like that could be F&B bank, or it could be some other thing, right? Like you have no idea. And so we found out very late that this, and we had to have a discussion about how do we deal with this when our own reporting is obviously discrediting this campaign, but at the same time, our organization is happy to profit from it. And it was, and again, the consideration to be made was there's not much advertising to be had. So yeah, if the newsroom is saying we cannot run this, then we're increasingly being told, then tell us who is going to replace that revenue. And in the end, I mean, fortunately, and I think that's something that we can still be proud of, is that there was no pressure to change the story, to change the substance of the story, or to change the fact that the story was running. I think that it was more the question about how credible is our story when we're also part of this campaign? And to what extent does the newsroom then actually have agency to change this? If we're saying nothing, we know this is phony, but what else can we do? But I think, Mia, I think that ethics is the only thing that we have, right? And I don't think that, some people, for example, won't take big tech money for good reason. The big tech companies have been the enablers of a huge destruction of public interest media and continue to profit from its destruction across the world. So, there, in various contexts, there are different ethical considerations to be made here. But in a context where that, there's so little funding to be had, can you really turn this down? Becomes more and more fraught, right? And it, perhaps a Bhekisisa might be able to say no to the pharmaceutical companies because it is still relatively well funded, relative compared to perhaps others in Africa. Whereas, a smaller newsroom somewhere will say, oh, sure, Roche wants to train us on cancer. Sure. Yeah, they're giving us $10,000 for that. We'll take that. Thank you. Right. And, it's no questions are asked about why they're doing this or the motive. They're really, the ethics are becoming increasingly seen as a luxury, to be honest, a position of privilege. And it should not be this. This is exactly why we need to mobilize to ensure that that we don't let these things slip. Because ultimately, the more and more we slip, the more and more, that we have to negotiate these principles, we lose something of what distinguishes public interest journalism from the TikTok track, right? So, what will ultimately distinguish, why should this be protected? Why do we need to have journalists protected? Why do there need to be safety protocols for these people? Because they perform an interest, a function in the public interest. And the more and more we compensate for that, I think the less the less that becomes relevant. So I think that, but it is hard. It is very, very hard. And especially in places where the journalists are not running the business, where they don't have participation in the business decisions that are made. It is ever more hard. And then, we can sit here in this webinar and talk about it, but at the end of the day, there are journalists who have kids to put through school, who have rent to pay. And how do you meet those realities? I think these, we have to increasingly, I think, have these open questions. And I think that also understand from editors some of the constraints that they're facing right now, because they are increasingly scary, I think.
Particularly with this big shift to digital spaces as well. I think, can we perhaps also look at some of the ethical rules that apply to traditional journalism, and is that enough for social media? How do we handle things like misinformation or manipulated content online? So certainly in both fields, but just I see we have a question there from Gloria, and that ties in quite well with the idea of corrections or accountability. Your story, Mia, the question was, who actually, oh no, I think it might. So it said, thank you to Patel for sharing her experience. I'd like to know how she went about her situation, the story about the Somali woman. And I think here what we'd also like to potentially look at is, what does a meaningful correction or apology look like? How can newsrooms build public trust when they get things wrong?
Absolutely. So, the thing is, I'm part of this community, right? I live down the road from, from where we'd taken these pictures. Of course, very different realities. These are people who've left homes at very young age and mostly have walked hundreds and hundreds of kilometers to find safety. So very different realities. But I mean, when I finally realized what they were, because for a long time I just thought they were being precious. Like, I could not understand where that anger was coming from. I did not say that. I did not imply that at all. I mean, the only thing I implied in the story is that we have a problem with really bad driving from Somali people, and I thought that was said, that was understood to be, well in jest. And so for a long time I thought, was my joke not well understood? Is it that one? I couldn't. And it's set. But when I finally understood, I went to community leaders and I explained. And by then, many of the women don't live in this community anymore, live elsewhere. So the closest I could do was actually go to community leaders and speak to as many people as I can to apologize and to explain, and to commit to doing better. So in this case here, I had to do that. It wasn't, I mean, an apology in the paper would have been meaningless, right? Because they would not have seen it. But I think that the fact that I could go out to them and speak to them and speak openly and honestly, and also admit that I'm really sorry. Like, you understand, like, I haven't understood what this was about. I think that certainly has helped me also heal my relationship with with this particular community, my ability to tell their stories going forward.
And then I'm also interested in the idea of transparency, ethical storytelling in practice. You know, there's this idea that you can record any conversation that you're part of, but then we are also ethically obliged to state, this is an on the record interview. We, of course, as journalists, we speak off the record all the time. That's how we get our stories. But can we maybe just shift discussion slightly towards something like that? Because I think those lines might blur. Prof. Harbour is here as well. Perhaps you can, just contribute to this. When is it all right for you to use information that you have not explicitly been given permission to use? So maybe just an explanation as to how students or how journalists, media practitioners can draw from what we, the information that we have. But then, of course, putting someone on the record is a totally different story. So being undercover, how does one do that? We know investigative journalists we all work for the public interest, but I'm interested in those kinds of ethics. Perhaps we could dive into that. Anyone who would like to contribute? Prof. du Toit, Gloria, anyone? You're muted.
This reminds me of a story I wanted to pursue. It was an investigative story, and I was calling one of the leaders in that field, and he was quarreling with me because he didn't want to give me the information, and he wanted me to go through many corners to get the information. And he was actually, when he was quarreling, he was giving me what I wanted. But remember, he was not allowed to speak officially to the media. So my question was, should I start recording or not? Because I knew if I asked him, I'm going to record you, he would not allow to be recorded. So
what do you do?
I remember that time.
Sorry to just jump in there. So if you were to record him, what would the purpose be of that recording? Would it be, and who is this person? Is this a person of public interest? Is this a person, for example, is it a scandal relating to a police minister? There are so many kind of layers, and that's why I'm really hoping Prof. Harbour, Prof. du Toit can jump in here.
Well, let me tell you a story that I think illustrates quite usefully different attitudes to the issue of going undercover. We once had a panel at the African Investigative Journalism Conference with three very different journalists discussing the ethics of undercover reporting. So the first was from Reuters, a person who'd done a major award-winning story exposing the Philippines president, who was so involved in the anti-drug, who did terrible things. What was his name in the anti-drug campaign?
Duterte.
That's right, Duterte, and actually did a remarkable story. She said, Reuters is a news agency. The rule is absolutely clear. You cannot go undercover. You have to let everyone know you're a journalist first and foremost. Unbreakable rule. But look, I managed to get the story the same. It made it harder, but I got it. Then there was the guy from Channel 4 who had been responsible for the story where they got, I'm sorry, my memory's, I'm losing my memory. The story where they got an admission from somebody stealing information off Facebook and selling it to political parties. You remember that story? Major story, very important story. The Channel 4 rule was you could go undercover under certain circumstances with editorial permission, and only when there was no other way to get the story, but you couldn't entrap. So you couldn't entrap. In other words, you couldn't lead them into the trap. You had to let them walk into that space where they were going to tell you stuff. And what they did was they hired an actor, and they trained this actor very carefully to pretend he was someone else and get this person talking, but absolutely to make sure he never entrapped. He never suggested what he wanted to hear and led him down that road. But he said, look, we got the story, and it had major impact. And the third is somebody many of you will know, Anas Anas, the Ghanaian master of undercover journalism, a kind of legend of African journalism. The man you often see with beads over his face because he tries to hide his identity so he can go underground all the time. And he said, look, I have one aim: catch them, get them put into prison. Do what you have to do. If you have to go undercover, if you have to lie, if you have to pretend to be something else, if you have to mislead, if you have to entrap, the point is to catch the crooks, work with the police, get them convicted and put into prison. That's what matters. So you can see very different attitudes.
Exactly, varying approaches.
And
Yes.
just to tell you, for example, Anas got 14 judges, if I remember correctly, in Ghana jailed because he entrapped them into taking bribes.
So, is there a clear-cut answer to this? No.
No. So the point I was leading to was, be careful of seeing ethics as a set of rules. You can do this, you can't do that. I don't think that's the case because, there's certain things you can't do, but you can if it really is in the public interest and there's no other way to get the story. But on that hand, you can't do anything for those reasons. So to me, ethics is about understanding the problems and the issues, understanding that what you do can cause harm. I think the root of it is to understand that journalism can do an immense amount of good and it can harm people as well. And very often you're doing an important public interest story, but you're also going to hurt people, sometimes without intending it. So there's no strict rules. It's being conscious of how you may cause harm and hurt people and looking to avoid that. I don't think we teach ethics as a set of yes or no rules, because life is not like that.
Thank you, Prof. Any questions coming up, please? We'd love to hear from you. Anything at all. We are just sort of finishing up, wrapping up now. So if there are any questions, anything you'd like to ask the panel, please do go ahead. I think perhaps touching on the idea of trauma, harm, and vulnerability. How should journalists approach interviews with survivors, with trauma survivors? What are the risks of sort of re-traumatizing subjects, and how can that be avoided? So is it ever ethical to show graphic images of suffering or death? These are the kinds of questions I'm leaning towards. How do we report on children or vulnerable groups responsibly? I mean, we've seen the World Health Organization quite openly picture children who seem as though they could be dying of hunger in places like Sudan. And then perhaps you could argue, well, the impact of that picture, of that graphic image, is so much more than the damage to one. So what really is in the greater good, and what is what's in the public interest? So trauma, harm, and vulnerability, would anyone like to just touch on any of those aspects?
Kat, I would like to say that in cases like that, I think dignity is a really important thing. But dignity is something different to different people. And for me, the bigger issue is, you know, that different decisions get made for different populations. It may be okay to go to a poor African community and show, remember that picture of that child with a bird, with a eagle or something, that the hungry child with a big bird next to it. But you would very rarely see pictures like that, say, in Europe, right? The same decisions wouldn't be taken about exposing people's dignity or a lack of dignity in that way. So I think the issue for me is to know how you're making that decision. And do you make decisions to be more graphical in a community that's vulnerable and that has less power than you have? Or would you have made the same decision in a community where you know the consequences, or people might look at you in a different way if you do it? And I think we need to, I think it's very important that we value dignity beyond our own cultures and beyond our own frame of reference. I have a story that you know, when I was a young journalist, I worked at the SABC for TV news. And I interviewed a rape survivor who gave full permission to talk to me. I didn't reveal her identity. You know, all the shots were shots where she couldn't be identified, and we changed her voice a bit. And then she was terribly upset with me afterwards. And she said, well, you interviewed me in my home. She had a very small home in a township. And everyone is going to know that's my home. And I felt like, well, surely you sat there and you knew your home's pictures was going to be on, but yet it had a very different implication for her. People could now know who she was. And sometimes I don't have an answer for something like that. I think, you know, if I had to redo stuff like that, I will think twice about doing it in someone's home. But I guess what I want to bring across is it's complicated. It means different things to different people.
Catherine?
Sorry? Oh, do you want to finish, or can I pose a final question?
I was just going to suggest to Catherine that I do think it would be good if we hear from the students. Because I mean, this is the students are who we're here for. And I'm really curious to know what you're thinking about, you know. I was saying earlier that it might be a good thing for you to kind of think about your own experience as working as journalists, and whether there were things that came up that you're wondering about. But I see there is a hand up now.
Brilliant. Please go ahead. Sia.
Sia, you need to unmute.
Oh,
Yeah.
Good evening. Thank you. Thank you for recognizing my hand. So I just have, I'm so sorry, I'm going to have to revert a little bit from the previous topic before we got to the one that we talked about now. So my question is based on the ethical responsibility. So basically, when, as journalists, basically, because we're still, you know, emerging journalists, I think I would love to know when and where do we draw the line between ethical responsibility and relying into our own hunches, more especially in cases where you feel like you are caught in the middle. A practical example, currently I am doing a film documentary of farm workers, former farm workers. They still live in the farm and they're willing for their story to be told. But at the same time, the farm in which they live in, the farm owner where they live in, threatens their life. So they no longer work for the farm owner, they no longer work on the farm. And so they have nothing at the end of the day, they have lost everything. They just have the piece of land that they live in, and they don't mind, they really want their story to be told so that they can get help from the public in terms of legal representation and all of those other stuff. But the issue is this story could also threaten their life because they still live in the farm that is owned by this person, and he has access to everything that they own. And from the interview that we've conducted, they've also mentioned that sometimes the farm owner walks in the middle of that when they're sleeping. They wake up with a white man inside their house. So do we then tell the story because it will save them without having to worry about their life? Where do we then draw the line of ethical responsibility?
A good example.
Very good question. Thank you. And we'd love to hear from someone else as well. Would anyone like to answer that or respond? What do you think, Sia? What do you think?
On my hand. Okay, so how we decided to approach the matter was that we went ahead and started recording, did the interviews. We visited the farm, even though it was very intense. When we got there with cameras, we were told that we were trespassing. But how we managed to get access to the information was that we were trying to help the people get public help so that they can leave the farm. Therefore, then the farm owner would still have the piece of land that was occupied by the people. And then that's the way that we have access the information and the people. But I think I can't stop but to feel that when the documentary is done and it's published and the farm owner gets access to it in any way or how, and he feels that he did not get the opportunity to represent his side of the story, it might also end up otherwise. So I think that's the reason why I raised my hand to ask this question, so that going forward we approach it with caution, and so that we don't put other people's lives at risk. If I'm making sense.
Absolute sense. Yes. Thank you for that. Thank you. Mia, would you like to respond to that? Because you did mention something about representation and how some things don't have equal weight. You mentioned, for example, with the COVID-19 vaccine, looking at science, looking at other, you need to give everyone a voice in a story, or rather that's generally our code of ethics guides us to approach things that way. What do you think in this particular situation? How should it be approached?
I just want to make sure I get the question right. Should we reveal the identities of the victims in this case? Is there a bigger danger, and should he give an opportunity to the farmer to speak? Is that the question? So
correct.
I'm always very wary if there are implications for people who can really, if there's one very powerful person and there are people who can't protect themselves. And even though the farm workers are willing to speak, there are big dangers that, they could face death basically, or being attacked, or led into a trap, or so. If I were you, I think I would think hard about a way to tell the story without revealing the identities. But that's very hard in
Very
that
hard to
case
do that.
for TV, because however you're gonna hide their identity, the farmer's gonna know who's who, right? Because he worked with them at some stage. I'm not sure what the way for TV is. I mean, there are various ways to not reveal people, right? Where you really can't see who they are. You put them in a different circumstance. I sometimes find if you change voices and stuff, the story becomes a bit less humane, if it sounds like not a different voice, but a clearly voice that sounds more tin-like, or so that you don't know who it is. I do think in a case like that, you would give the farmer a chance to say something, because you need to confront him, right? It's not the same as say giving an anti-vaxxer a voice that just talks nonsense about science. There is a perceived perpetrator in this case, and I think it's not just to give the person a chance to speak, but it's also to get to the truth, to ask him all those questions that the farm workers can't ask him because they're not in a position to ask them. Khadija might have better answers.
It's an intriguing case, I think. You know what? Yeah, I mean, what I worry about is how do you guarantee impact in the right way, like the right kind of impact. You're not sure that your story will definitely result in legal representation, etc. You know, it could not, right? But instead, the only impact it gets is heightening the tensions between the workers and the farm owner. So yeah, it's a high, I mean, obviously a compelling story. We're guided by a sense of justice often, and you want to do right by these people. But how do you tell such a story when you know, there is such a disparity here in power between the two sides. It's yeah, I mean, I would go very gently in and just try to find various ways of being able to do it. Perhaps find other similar stories, make this not about just this one farm, make it about conditions on farms in an area. So, you know, to try to cushion some of the recognizability of the people talking. You know, I would find different ways to frame it, really to keep in mind the powerlessness of these people and what remains when our cameras turn away to the next story. I think is what we must always keep in mind. Their
Catherine, do
lives
you mind?
continue.
Catherine?
I'm with you, yes.
I was just going to say, when we're here to talk about freedom of expression, so you know, it's really at the heart of the conversation, of that tension between doing harm to people and making sure that their voices are heard. That Sia is talking about here. So even, you know, more than in most instances, these are people who do not get the chance to speak for themselves. In terms of the sort of stories that we're asking students to tell for the purposes of the Speak Up South Africa project, it's one that one should, you know, not let go of too easily. And I think that some of the suggestions that were made now, especially regarding, I mean, with this particular project, the students are working on a number of farms around Makanda. If one was to make it more general and work in audio rather than in visual, and one of the techniques that I've heard quite a lot that the BBC uses in cases where they're trying to protect the people that speak, is when you actually replace the voice with somebody else's voice. So the announcer or narrator of a story will say, this voice has been revoiced by another person to protect the identity of the person. So I mean, I think we are talking about a very close little community where the voices of people will be recognized. But I do think one has to fight for people's right to speak.
Yes. And how blatant does one go?
Yeah.
Do you want to make a loud big bang, and what is the impact of that?
Yes.
Ethically, but in so many different spheres. And what other tools can one use to generate conversation about something as intrinsically deep as this? Can we use social media? Can we because we can make things go viral if we want to. And is that impact possibly not going to be greater than I'm not at all putting the work and the investigation and the story at any kind of disrepute or lower regard. Just how does one utilize all the tools that we have available to us to really tell the story? Because we are competing with a lot. Can we please have one more question? I know this has been such a fantastic conversation, but we have been running out of time, and I would so love to hear from one more voice, just one more student, whatever kind of contribution you'd like to make. Is there anyone who would like to contribute? Here we go. Prof, would you mind reading that for us?
Let me see. Okay, so from Minenhle Mbali Ndlela, when we link the concept of freedom of expression and biased integrity as journalists, how do you balance the ratio to ensure that a story enables the victims' voices to be heard? Also, I'm curious to know, how would Khadija approach the initial story that she wrote regarding the Somalians? I think that one was already answered, hey? I'm not sure, but so maybe more the first question there.
Yeah, we'll open that to the panel. When we link the concept of, and perhaps Anton, the concept of freedom of expression and biased integrity, as journalists, how do we balance the key ratio? So how do we find that balance to ensure that the story enables the victims' voices to be heard? It's a tough question. It's a very difficult question to answer. Something that Prof. Harbour mentioned in the previous webinar that we had was, we really don't want people. There's this notion that the journalist has a reputation of going out into a community, getting a story, and then leaving. But it's so much more than that. How does one see it through? How does one follow through? Who would like to comment?
So I'll say that, as Anton said, we have to be guided by the public interest always. And sometimes it's a fuzzily defined concept, but basically we must be able to ask, why do people need to know about this? Right? And you need to be able to explain that very simply, because they need to know that judges in this district are corrupt. And so there is no chance of rule of law succeeding. Okay, that is a very compelling argument, yes. So I think that, being able to make the case for it very, very clear and very simple, being guided by that, ultimately has to identify why your story is worth publishing, why it is worth actually, digging up trauma, putting certain communities at risk, all of these things. I will say that, after many years of experience, if I had to do that story about Mayfair again, I would write it quite differently, right? I think that, first of all, I would look at the captions to the pictures, like something, it was something I never thought to do. I would have asked to have more agency in the picture selection, and also ensure that journalists don't write the captions for newspapers, or they never used to previously. Probably an AI bot writing it now in newsrooms. I think what I realize now is that I had tried to write that story as an outsider, with an outsider's view of a community, when actually I'm part of that community. And that is the lens that I should have used, and I should use that lens so that I feel like that story would have been more compelling, that it would have also allowed me to be more trusted to the community at that time, if they saw me as one of them, as rather than this journalist who's coming in and telling the story.
Great, wonderful.
Thank you very much to everyone who's taken the time to attend this webinar. Particularly, thank you to the Rhodes School of Journalism and Media Studies. Thank you to our panel, Khadija, Mia, Gloria. Thank you so much for taking this time. What we're going to be doing is uploading this full video onto YouTube, so you can access it there. The other seminars also on YouTube. And as always, reach out. We're available. We want to help. You have my email with regards to your projects. If you need some consultation on that, please don't hesitate to reach out. And if you're not following CFE on social media, please do that as well. And then lastly, we'll see you again on the 7th of August for our next topic, which is creative storytelling for advocacy. So
Fantastic.
thank you very much, everyone. Have a good evening.
Thanks, Catherine, you too, and to everybody who's contributed.
Thank you, Prof. Harbour. Thanks, Prof. Totoy.